So with this first video on the muscular system, I'm going to focus on these key bullet points here, and I'm going to turn to more of the microanatomy of muscle in a following video. So key goals for this mini lecture are going to be to talk about the main functions of muscle, of muscular tissue, to distinguish between a muscle's origin and its insertion. And then I'm going to turn to a whiteboard feature and describe the connective tissue sheaths that are going to surround the muscle, the fascicles, and then within the fascicles, the muscle cells or muscle fibers. So I'd like you at the end of this video to feel comfortable enough with those terms that you could potentially sketch it out on your own, turning to a blank sheet of paper and trying to use your new vocabulary to label all those features. And then the last thing is I do want to connect these connective tissue sheaths to a histology, and I want to be able to indicate where those different features are with under the microscope. So here we go. Let's start with some prior knowledge here, right? So these are all tissues that we've already looked at under the scopes. So if you pause for a moment, hopefully you can identify each one of these muscle types. So we've got skeletal muscle really zoomed in here at 1200. Cardiac muscle, so you have the branching, you have the intercalated disc. That is a telltale sign that we're looking at cardiac muscle. And then lastly, right here, you've got smooth muscle. This in particular is taken from the small intestine. And so the smooth muscle here, think about what its function would be, because that's where we're going next. So when you think about the functions of muscle, movement is oftentimes the first thing that comes to mind, and that is fitting, but we oftentimes only think about it with regard to skeletal muscle. So I wanted to begin things by presenting and getting you to think about smooth muscle and cardiac muscle first, because they are obviously also going to play a role in movement. So in thinking about the smooth muscle, right, you've got smooth muscle that's going to surround not only your small intestine, your stomach, your esophagus, and that's going to be involved in peristalsis and ensuring that food is moving and chyme is moving through your GI tract. So that's a pretty critical function. You also have smooth muscle that surrounds things such as your pupil. So the pupil being the hole. The colored part of your eye, right, the iris, that is comprised of two different smooth muscles. So involuntary control in both cases. And that smooth muscle will be able to control, to move the pupil, if you will, and to be able to control how much light is going to enter your retina. So again, just getting you to think about some additional functions of muscular tissue. Certainly with skeletal muscle, we see that it's going to play a role not only in tugging on skeletal bone and enabling us to move throughout our environment, but skeletal muscle is involved, right? If you think about just posture, right? Holding your heavy head up, holding your torso up as you sit here, right? So all of those muscles involved in postural control and positioning are going to play a key role. Stabilizing joints. So if you think about injuring a joint, right, one of the key ways to rehab that joint and bring it back to its full range of motion and full functionality is to really strengthen the muscles around it. Generating heat. Certainly, if your body temperature falls below the homeostatic set point, right, something we talked about the very first week of this class, our skeletal muscles can be recruited for involuntary shivering, right? And that shivering is going to be very effective at generating heat. And then you're going to also see, right, so visceral organs are going to be supported by muscles. Sphincters, right? So you've got a cardiac sphincter here that will control the passage of food into your stomach. So when this cardiac sphincter doesn't seal sufficiently, that's when you can get acid reflux or heartburn. Pyloric sphincter here, if you go on to take more A&P, you'll gain an appreciation for how important it is in regulating and ensuring that food chyme doesn't pass too quickly into your small intestine. So these are some of the key functions that I want you to bear in mind as we talk about muscular tissue. Now, the rest of this video, the rest of my focus on chapter 9 on the muscles is really going to hone in on skeletal muscle specifically. So this is really the last that will spend time talking about smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. So when you think about muscle, don't forget that it is an organ, right? Cells build to form the tissues, right? So skeletal, smooth, and cardiac tissues. But then when you look at the muscle as a whole, you've also got arteries, you've got veins, you've got nerves, right? And so it's all of these systems combined that makes a muscle. So it is at the organ level. So you're seeing, intercostal muscle here that sits between your ribs. So you may not think about that as being a critical muscle in your body, but even these tiny muscles have their own artery, their own vein, their own nerve. And we're going to see that skeletal muscle contraction. So every skeletal muscle fiber, muscle cell, is going to be controlled by an attaching nerve ending, every single one in the skeletal muscle. So you may have heard that muscle burns more calories than fat, and that is the case, and that's simply because it is a highly metabolically active tissue. So turning now to look at the distinction between origin of a muscle and insertion of a muscle. So one way to think about the origin of a muscle is to think about it as the anchor point. You can think about it as the bone that a muscle is attached to that is less movable or even immovable. And then the insertion is going to be the bone that the muscle is essentially yanking on. So this is where it pays immensely to be able to know the function of a muscle. So what does a muscle do? How does it move the body? So if you can think about that, then it makes the origin and insertion, it makes determining that origin and insertion really intuitive. So let's start off with one that a muscle that we all know, your bicep brachii do. If you think about your standard bicep curl, right? So when you are doing a bicep curl, when you are flexing your biceps, right, what you're doing is you're moving your lower arm, right? So this bicep brachii muscle, right, its insertion point is going to be on the radius, right, in your lower arm. We'll see that the brachialis that sits underneath the bicep brachii will have an insertion point on the ulna, so to tug on that bone. But that's literally what it's doing. So these are the anchor points. These are the points of origin. And then the insertion, again, is going to be on that radius. You should be able to know the origin of both the short head as well as the long head of your bicep brachii. And just as an example to help you appreciate why we had you learn all of these different features in the skeletal system, right? Here's the tendon of the short head here of the bicep, and its origin is actually on the coracoid process of the scapula. You can see the origin here is going to be on another aspect of the scapula. So these are the anchor points. This is what what the muscle is going to hold on to. You can think about it as that. So it's going to hold on to this while it pulls on this. Muscle cannot push. It can only pull. So you're always got to be thinking, okay, what bone is this muscle yanking on? So another one that a lot of people have familiarity with before studying the muscular system is your calf, more specifically your gastrocnemius. So if you think about flexing or contracting your gastroc, right, you can do it right now just sitting at your chair. Think about what's really moving, right? And what's really moving is in a sense your ankle, but more specifically, this gastroc is pulling on your calcaneus, right? On this heel bone, if you will. And so by pulling on your calcaneus, it plantar flexes your foot. So pointing your toes, if you will, right? That's really what your gastrocnemius is going to be doing. You could also think about heel raises, right? So you can kind of tap or tie this into exercises you may be familiar with, right? One way to strengthen your calf is to do heel raises or to do them off of a stair. And in that case, right, your heel is going up and down and up and down. And that gastroc is definitely being recruited to pull on that calcaneus. Meanwhile, the origin, right, the medial and lateral condyles of your femur. Let's do one more example here. So I like to highlight this one because I was just talking about the bicep brachii, and I think all too often people hear bicep and they immediately just think arm, right? But that's your bicep brachii, meaning arm. There's also your bicep femoris. Sorry, the font is so grainy. But your bicep femoris, so give you a second to picture this, right? So we're looking at the right leg, right? You've got your tibia, fibulas, lateral. So when a student is looking at a skeletal muscle model for the first time, they tend to look at this pair of muscles over here and assume that that is the bicep brachii, is bicep femoris. It's not, right? The bicep femoris is here, so it's lateral. What you see here are actually the semitendinosus, and then underneath it is the semimembranosus. So again, semitendinosus, T for top, and then semimembranosus is this broader muscle that sits underneath. So those two pairs of muscle sit medial, and then again, your bicep femoris is going to be this one that sits lateral. So bi is referring to two heads. So what you don't see in a model, what you don't see in this image, is you don't see both the long head and the short head. So if we pull back all these layers, that's really what this graphic is showing, right? So now you can really see the origin of the long head, the origin of the short head, and then the insertion here on that fibula. You also have another one that's wrapping around to the condyle of the tibia. And if you think about, so all of these muscles, so bicep femoris, semitendinosus, and semimembranosus, these are all part of your hamstrings. And the origin of that word apparently comes, so hamstrings apparently comes from butchers back in the day. They would hang pigs by these muscles because they are such strong muscles in all mammals, really. But that's the origin of that word hamstring. But these three muscles are all going to make up really strong flexors of your knee. So what these muscles are going to do, they're going to flex the knee, and they also extend the hip. And so to flex the knee, they've got to be able to cross this joint. So they will cross your knee joint. You're seeing that here. So they're crossing this joint, and they're going to pull on tibia, fibula, and enable your knee to bend. So muscles will always cross the joints that they move. So when thinking about how a muscle attaches to a bone, you can either have direct attachments or indirect. The indirect ones are more common. So with a direct attachment, a nice example of that is your trapezius here. So in this case, you actually see the epimysium, which I'll discuss very shortly here, of the muscle that's fusing to the periosteum, a term that we have seen, the connective tissue that wraps around bone. So those two are directly fused, or potentially to the perichondrium of the cartilage. With an indirect attachment, this is where you're going to have connective tissue that extends beyond the muscle as a tendon. So just like we were saying with the gastrocnemius, your Achilles tendon inserting into your calcaneus, you also have the short and long head of the bicep brachii that are nice examples of an indirect attachment. So we see this a lot with muscles attaching to bones. And then another type of an indirect muscular attachment is seen here with your latissimus dorsi, your lat. And here you actually have what's called an aponeurosis. So it's this sheet-like tendon that is going to serve to anchor onto the points of origin in this case. So just some examples of different ways that a muscle attaches to bone. So what I'd like to do now is turn to a whiteboard feature to elaborate on the different types of connective tissue and the different layers that we see in the muscular system.
This graphic does a nice job of helping you appreciate just the intricate organization of the muscle and the connective tissue sheaths that make it up. So first of all, you have muscle all the way out here, and you can see some of the veins and arteries that feed this, coming back to this idea of it being an organ. Now, the connective tissue sheath that wraps around the muscle, if you can see it here, this is what we're going to call your epimysium. So epi, think about the origin, right? So that means, that refers to upon or on. So we saw this root word when we looked at the epidermis, right? The superficial layer of the skin that sits on top of the dermis. So that is going to be our epimysium. And we'll see this mysium repeated with each of these three terms. So the epimysium, again, is what's going to surround the entire muscle. And then coming out of that, if you look, we are going to pull out, these are fascicles. So what a fascicle is, so what they're pulling out here, it's called this fascicle, and what this is it is defined as a bundle of muscle cells. So a muscle fiber is the same thing as a muscle cell. So remember that with the skeletal muscle, we're talking about cells that are so long that oftentimes you will see this term fiber substituted for the term cell. But this is a cell, this is a cell, this is a cell, this is a cell. So a fascicle is nothing more than a bundle of these muscle cells pulled together. The connective tissue tends to be that dense, irregular connective tissue. A nice example of this is when you deal with meat. If you're cooking meat and can picture the tissue that wraps around chicken or pork, right? That's really the epimysium that you're looking at there. So the connective tissue that surrounds a fascicle, it goes around. And if you can remember the root word for around, like a periscope, when that comes out and goes around. So this is going to be our perimysium. And then if you come down here at the cellular level to look at what surrounds a muscle cell. So that's what you're seeing here. Again, you can kind of see like a slightly shiny layer shown in this graphic. So what's going to surround the individual muscle cells or muscle fibers? So think about the root word that means inside or within. And this is going to be your endomysium. Zooming back out to come back to this epimysium. So if you follow this out, right, this is a tendon, right? So the ends of these epimysium can very much connect and form those tendons. So I'd like to zoom in now. So again, here's a fascicle. Here's one of these muscle cells or muscle fibers. And what I want you to notice is that there's additional organization at the level of the muscle cell. This whole thing is the cell. And you see that there's more to it than what I've just described. And so what each of these tubes, if I were to pull one of these out, you can kind of follow my art here. What each of these are going to be called is a myofibril. So again, this is what makes up each muscle cell. And you see that these cells are packed with these. So you'll have 100 to 1,000 of these myofibrils that are jam-packed in each cell. And know that they run the length of this cell and they attach to the sarcolemma. And that's going to become significant in this next video when we look at muscular contraction. So in these myofibrils and the sarcomeres that make them up contract, they're going to need something to yank on. And what they're going to yank on is going to be the sarcolemma at the ends of each one of these myofibrils. A little histology just to reinforce these different layers of connective tissue that I was describing. So here you have skeletal muscle. This is a fascicle. You can see that here. You've got another one here. You've got another fascicle here. So these are all these bundles of cells. And so the connective tissue that would wrap around it, right, again, is going to be your perimysium. that wraps. So you can see all these cells that are on the furthest outside of the skeletal muscle. So you can see the E here, that's representing the epimysium. And then it's frankly a bit too, so you can see a little bit of the perimysium here, additional perimysium here. And then what you really can't see on this graphic, we're just really not zoomed in quite well enough. You can kind of make out a little bit of it here and here. That's actually pretty good. So what you're seeing here then around each individual cell, right? Again, that's going to be your endomysium. Again, this is all fascicle, so all of this is your fascicle. You've got the perimysium that will be wrapping around it, and then these are the individual muscle cells or muscle fibers, right? And then the connective tissue that would wrap around each one of those is going to be that endomysium. So hopefully giving those examples and presenting it in different ways helps you to lock down that new vocabulary.